Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Jillian Melchior and Kate O'Dell, and we're talking about aid to Ukraine and the Ukraine war. And in addition to the actual hardware that the U.S. might turn over, is an issue of military strategy. And heretofore, there have been some limits that have been put on Ukraine's ability to use Western weapons to strike Russian territory. And even though the official U.S. position is, well, this is a decision up to Ukraine, they can make that decision. It's been a pretty clear message privately delivered, and we hear this from Ukrainian officials, that you really shouldn't use NATO weapons to attack Russia proper or even Crimea, which is the peninsula that Russia occupied in 2014, and the U.S. have never recognized as Russian territory even after Putin formally annexed it. And yet this morning, Kate, we have a New York Times story that's quoting anonymous officials, of course, so might be true, that the official U.S. attitude may be changing. The formal policy hasn't changed. They're still saying, oh, well, Ukraine, it's up to Ukraine. But there may be easing of the quiet counsel that says, don't use our weapons to hit Crimea, realizing that has provided Russia a sanctuary from which they can attack Ukraine. And as long as that exists, Russia is going to have an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the foundational principles of warfare is you don't tell your adversary what you are and are not going to do. And this is a prime example where we have given the Russians free ability to not have to defend their bases, their depots in Russia, and that has just given them an ability to concentrate all their forces in the east of Ukraine. So I think it would help the Ukrainians a lot if they could create a bigger problem set for the Russians and force them to defend some of those assets. And it also, I don't think Russia should be immune from the consequences if they decide to roll over a neighboring country and try to attack them. So it doesn't make any moral or strategic sense. But we've seen reporting that the U.S. tweaked with the HIMARS rocket systems we gave them to try to prevent them from launching long-range missiles like the Army's tactical missile system so that they can't hit targets in Russia. I just think this stipulation is now very much out of date, was probably never a good idea, but particularly as we're seeing the Russians do some exercise with Belarus, there may be urgent reason to lift that and start to give the Ukrainians more freedom to conduct the war as they see fit.
Just as a question on the battlefield, the ability of the Russians to resupply Crimea through Russia proper and then through Crimea to reinforce Russian forces in the eastern part of Ukraine is an advantage for them. And if that suddenly was taken away, or if Russia had to defend Crimea, that would stretch Russian forces and make it harder for them to do what they're doing in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces of Ukraine. The fear here, I guess, again, is if Ukraine took the war to Crimea, and I think you have to distinguish maybe between Russia proper and Crimea. But if the fear is if they take the war, and they've done some strikes on a couple of depots and so on, I think those were with other than NATO weapons, I guess, somehow the Russians would again escalate and I guess maybe try to drag NATO into this war. But again, that's a very difficult decision for Russia to make, because if it wants to engage with NATO, that's a very different level, and they're going to lose that fight, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. has wanted to get Russia out of Crimea for some time, but hasn't obviously seen fit to do it ourselves. So we should see it as an opportunity, since the Ukrainians are willing to fight and accomplish that. That would be in the U.S.'s interest, because I think one thing we have to really remember here that we were talking about earlier is that this is a narrow opening, and the Russians are going to regroup. They are working on reviving their industrial base. They are calling all the dictators that they can find and to try to get new ballistic missiles, drones, any weapons they can get. They are working on a multi-year expansion of their conventional forces, which maybe won't be successful, but is a testament to their commitment to waging this war. And so this is a narrow opening where we can change the direction of the war, because Russia is dug in and Putin is not going to be dissuaded by casualties. He's not going to just retire to spend more time with his family. He is all in on this war, and we have a narrow opening to change the direction of it.
So let's look at this from the point of view of those in the United States who disagree with our editorial position on Ukraine and would say, well, look, if Ukraine isn't winning and this is settling into a stalemate, then what is the U.S. interest in continuing the war? Aren't we just set here on a long-term quagmire, if you will, World War I style, where the more lives are lost and we spend more treasure, Ukrainians spend more blood, and we accomplish nothing. Meanwhile, Jillian, we're risking a NATO and Russia engagement that would be devastating to both sides. Now, as I say, that's not my argument, but that is the argument I hear. I'm trying to express it as fairly as possible. What's your response to that?
I think it's a faulty argument for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I think the Ukrainians have chosen this fight. They've chosen to defend their territory. And it's their choice to make, and they're undertaking the risk of that. So there's something to be said for that that's pretty considerable. I think just going back to the question of whether Ukraine is losing the war, I don't think it's winning the war right now, but I don't think it's losing the war either. And in the fall, we saw very impressive offenses driving the Russian forces back from around Kharkiv, from around Kherson, changing the momentum. And a lot of that was done with U.S.-provided HIMARS. And if you look at what we saw in those liberated territories, it was immense suffering. Letting the Russians take that territory and hold that territory results in torture, rape, horrific crimes against Ukrainian civilians. I think that's kind of the secondary point, that it's not merciful. And I guess the third point about the broader national security concerns here, it's really dangerous to have an expansionist authoritarian power learn that he can take territory by force. And you got to keep in mind what comes after Ukraine. You've got Moldova, perhaps, but then you've got Romania, you've got Poland, you've got NATO territory. And I think there's no guarantee that Putin will be content just taking Ukraine if he is allowed to do that. You know, right now the United States has the opportunity to help the Ukrainians do the fighting. They're not asking for U.S. boots on the ground. They're asking for the equipment that they need to defeat the Russians. And that's making Russia less of a long-term threat, and less of a long-term threat that the United States and NATO may have to deal with at some point if Putin is unchecked.
So the U.S. strategic interest would be that if we stop Russia here, with the Ukrainians willing to fight and sacrifice so much, that we would leave, if Russia were forced to withdraw and understand that it had lost its bet on Ukraine and was not left with territory in Ukraine from which it could regroup and threaten Ukraine and Moldova and the rest in the future, that we would have a more stable European security environment. And that would reduce the costs of our aid in the long term, clearly could do that, even if we had to reinforce parts of the eastern flank of NATO. And that would certainly be in the U.S. interests long term. I think that's just the strongest argument for our strategic interests. I mean, I take the moral point that Jillian makes, but the isolationists in the U.S. would respond on the human rights argument, well, there's a lot of bad actors in the world, and you can't fight that, and why should we risk a nuclear exchange with Russia or a NATO engagement with Russia because Vladimir Putin's a bad person? So it's a strategic argument that I think is the strongest one if you're going to make it to the emerging isolationists on the American right.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to forget that we could be living right now with Putin camped out on the border of Poland had he rolled over the Ukrainians, and what kind of a nightmare that would be for NATO and how much harder it would be. We are already moving some of our forces to NATO's Eastern Front to harden that in Poland, but that would not be an improvement for NATO. And I think the risk here of a stalemate, as we're describing, the strategic risk, is that Russia will regroup and then restart the war on terms favorable to them. And that is not a war that NATO wants to have to be involved in. And this idea that he is simply going to take over parts of Ukraine and call it a day just does not check out to anybody who's studied what he's written about what he thinks about Russia's reincorporation. So I think the case to make is a cold strategic one, that we are degrading an enemy military at a relatively low cost in weapons and at no cost to American life. And the goal now should be to finish that job and evict him from Ukraine and not give him an opportunity to restart this even closer to NATO territory.
I should add that no less a political strategic realist as Henry Kissinger says that Ukraine, after this, is going to need some kind of affiliation with NATO, formal affiliation after the war, because of the clear and obvious now threat to Ukraine and Europe that Putin and Russia have posed. Whereas before, he was reluctant to say that. And I would also say, as a political matter here in the United States, President Biden has received plaudits, some of it deserved, for keeping the coalition in support of Ukraine together. Not always easy, particularly given the German and French view. But if this ends with Russia occupying significant portions of Ukraine and a stalemate that leaves Ukraine vulnerable, then I think some of that credit and that applause will turn into, why did we give so much aid to Ukraine? And real doubts about whether or not Biden has performed well here. So there is some political risk for Biden in the incremental, reluctant aid strategy, partial aid strategy that they have been pursuing, particularly if opposition continues to build in parts of the isolationist Republican caucus against further aid to Ukraine. So now is the moment. I want to thank Kate and I want to thank Jillian for all of your work on these subjects. And thanks everybody for listening. We're back every day on Potomac Watch, so please check us out tomorrow. Thanks for listening.